Good morning, everyone. This is Martin Murphy from the ILO Department of Communications. I hope you're all doing very well. Welcome to the launch of the 6th edition of the ILO Monitor on COVID-19 and the world of work. With us today, as always, are ILO Director General Guy Ryder and Zhangjun Li, the Director of the ILO Employment Policy Department. You will have received the press release by now. We will begin, as always, with a brief introduction by the DG, and then we'll move on to your questions. We have until midday. All your mics will be muted, so if you can please raise your hand when you want to ask a question, and we'll give you the floor. The language of the press briefing will be English. So let's start right away. So I'll ask the DG to take the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Martin. Greetings to our colleagues from the media. Thank you for your interest and welcome to this briefing and the launch of our 6th edition of the ILO's COVID-19 Monitor. Since March, as you know, the ILO has been tracking the impact of COVID-19 on the world of work, and this 6th edition of the Monitor updates our previous figures on global working hour losses, and it also looks at the impact of COVID-19 on labor income. In other words, what people earn by working. And then we look at the impact of the different fiscal stimulus packages which have been introduced by governments around the world, and focus on what we are calling a fiscal stimulus gap for developing countries, which we see as having emerged. And finally, and I think it's important, we look ahead to the 4th quarter of 2020 and then the beginning of next year. What I want to do is to highlight what I see as the key points in the monitor, and then I and my colleague, particularly Zhangjun Li, who is the leader of the team that writes the monitor, will be happy to take your questions. So let me turn first to the common feature of all of our monitors, which is the loss in working hours, and then move on to the knock-on effect of that on labor income. All of these figures, let me recall, are benchmarked against the last 3 months of 2019, i.e. the last full quarter that we could describe as being pre-COVID. That's our baseline. Now, in this latest monitor, we estimate that the global loss in working hours in the first 9 months of 2020 has been considerably larger than we estimated in the last 5th edition of the monitor that was issued at the end of June. Our last estimate, the previous estimate for the 2nd quarter of this year, was for the loss of 14% of global working time, equivalent to the loss of 400 million full-time equivalent jobs. Today, we raise that figure to 17.3%, so from 14% to 17.3%, and that comes to 495 full-time job equivalents compared to 400 million in our previous estimates. That's for the 2nd quarter. For the current 3rd quarter, our estimate is that 12.1% of global working time will be lost, and that comes to 345 million full-time job equivalents. And then looking forward to the 4th quarter of this year, this situation as well has worsened significantly since the last assessment in June. We present 3 possible scenarios for the 4th quarter, and the baseline scenario now projects that 8.6% of global working time will be lost, and that corresponds to 245 million full-time job equivalents. The obvious question is, why do we see these significant negative evolutions? Well, one obvious reason is that many countries continue to struggle to get the pandemic under control, And as it persists, well, the employment situation worsens. But another reason is that more data has become available on workers in developing and emerging countries, particularly with respect to the informal economy. And we see that they have been affected worse by the COVID crisis than they were by previous crises. Interestingly as well, if we try to disaggregate the loss in working hours, we see that there has been a particularly large increase in inactivity, which has in fact been rising faster than unemployment. And we believe that this has important policy consequences and implications. Now, colleagues, what effect has all of this had on workers for their ability to pay for food and other necessities? Quite simply, the impact has been catastrophic. We estimate in this monitor, once we exclude the impact of government support measures, that global labor income declined by an extraordinary, a massive 10.7% in the first 9 months of 2020. That translates into a loss of 3.5 trillion US dollars, an equivalent of 5.5% of global GDP in the period concerned. The greatest impact was in lower middle income countries, where labor income losses were over 15%. And of course, on top of this, these are places where there are the weakest social protection systems, so there are very few resources or protections for working people to fall back upon. If you look at it regionally, the Americas were the worst affected, with a drop in labor incomes of just over 12%, 12.1%. Now, as you are all aware, as we are constantly seeing, many countries have introduced large-scale fiscal stimulus packages. These have come to the equivalent of about 11% of last year's GDP, 9.6 trillion US dollars, as measured at the beginning of September. Now, for those countries for which there is sufficient data, we have found a very clear correlation between larger fiscal stimulus packages on the one hand and lower working hour losses on the other. This is to say that the larger the fiscal stimulus as a percentage of GDP, the lower the working hour losses. An additional increase in fiscal stimulus equivalent to 1% of annual GDP would have reduced working hour losses by a further 0.8 percentage points. And if there had been no fiscal stimulus whatsoever for the second quarter of this year, then working hour losses would have stood at 28% instead of the 17.3% that we have actually observed. Now, beneath this global situation, we have identified what we term as a fiscal stimulus gap, which has emerged between advanced economies, which clearly have greater resources to hand, and developing countries with more limited means. We estimate that the fiscal stimulus gap stands at 982 billion US dollars. And this is defined as the amount needed for developing countries to inject so that they can have the same level of stimulus funding relative to working time that has actually been lost as high income countries. So this would be what the gap that needs to be closed to have equivalent ratio of stimulus to working hour losses between high income and developing countries. And that gap is 982 billion US dollars. Now, this is an extremely worrying observation. It runs a risk of leading us to a post-COVID world with greater inequalities between regions, countries, sectors, and social groups. It is the polar opposite of the better world that we want to build back. And I think it reminds us all that unless we're all able to overcome and get out of this pandemic, then none of us will. This fiscal stimulus gap is a big number, 982 billion. But let's put it into some perspective. The amount that would be needed by low-income countries, just the low-income countries, to plug their fiscal stimulus gaps would be just 45 billion US dollars. And that is the equivalent to less than 1% of the fiscal stimulus packages announced by high-income countries. And that puts, I think, an important perspective on the affordability of all of this. Now, in this monitor, as I indicated at the outset, we try to look forwards, we try to look ahead. And in the final part of the monitor, we talk about some of the policy challenges that we will face and some of the things that we believe need to be done. And there are some 5 issues here. Firstly, and we've said this before, the right balance and sequence of health, economic and social policy interventions continues to be crucial. Premature loosening of health measures risks prolonging the pandemic, and that in turn would worsen its overall labor market impact. There isn't a playoff here. Secondly, it is clear that support for jobs and labor income will need to be maintained and sustained and continue into next year. That's required to keep employment, businesses, and incomes afloat. And policy interventions will therefore need to be maintained at the necessary scale while having to be as well increasingly effective and efficient. The third policy challenge relates to the substantial gaps in the fiscal stimulus packages for countries which have fewer fiscal options and gaps that need to be plugged. And this is what I've referred to already. We really do need to look at boosting channels such as technical help, debt restructuring, relief, and increasing official development assistance. That type of international solidarity in the face of this global pandemic that our circumstances demand. Fourthly, and it's been a consistent theme of what the ILO has had to say about the impact of this pandemic, we need to give a particular priority to support measures for vulnerable and hard-hit groups. Amongst those, of course, are women, young people, and informal workers. And lastly, and we've emphasized this again throughout the crisis, social dialogue needs to continue to be used as a key instrument in overcoming the challenges. And as those challenges and the policy choices before us become increasingly complex, it may be more difficult to maintain the commitment to social dialogue, but that needs to be done because it has a track record of producing practical, fair, and accepted results, ones that work. So, dear colleagues, that's what I had to say. It is starkly clear now that no group, no country, no region will beat COVID-19 alone. We need to use this crisis to put ourselves on the path to a better future of work, one that is both inclusive and sustainable. And this is possible if we base our strategies on solidarity, cooperation, and dialogue. So again, thank you for your attention. I hand it back to Martin, and I and my colleague Sang-Yeon Lee stand ready to respond to your questions and comments.
Thank you, DG. Let's go on to the Q&A now. The first question comes from Laurent Sierra from the Swiss News Agency. Laurent, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. So DG, thank you for the briefing. You have now these 3 scenarios forecast for the end of the year. Is the pessimistic scenario taking into account potential new lockdowns, or could it be worse with the new lockdowns? And secondly, we've seen that some developed countries have launched again lockdowns, but only in some poor workers' neighborhood within cities. Do you fear that there might be within developed countries 2 different systems for people? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Let me make a preliminary response to those two parts to the question, and then perhaps pass it across to Sang-Yeon for perhaps a more technical response in respect of the pessimistic scenario into the fourth quarter, but which I will preempt him by saying, yes, that does contemplate the possibilities of intensification of lockdown measures or more stringent restrictions. Whether they would be a full second lockdown or not, I'll leave Sang-Yeon to comment upon. Look, one thing we are seeing, and it's commented upon in the monitor, is the evolution of lockdown measures has been different depending on whether we are talking about a high income or a lower income countries. It has clearly been more difficult for lower income countries to sustain restrictions, lockdowns on economic activity, simply because of the absence of social protection, the fact that there are large sectors of their populations, who simply survive by virtue of their daily income from work. And this poses extraordinary problems. Where countries have maintained or continued to apply stringent lockdown measures, we call them lockdown measures for all but essential services and functions, these have become more targeted. They don't apply across the board in a blanket manner, but tend to be focused upon particular geographical regions or activities. To try to respond to the final point that you make, I think it has become a commonplace that this COVID-19 experience is opening up wedges between those who are better placed and those who are less well placed on labor markets. And I've spoken already to the need to be particularly attentive to the needs of the more vulnerable. Whether that type of development becomes worse during or in the aftermath of the COVID-19 experience depends entirely on the policy response that we bring to it. And our hope is, and our strong advocacy is for, the types of measures that would prevent this type of social polarization, if I might call it. But with those comments, let me pass over to Sang-Yeon. Perhaps you've got some more detail on our fourth quarter scenario projections.
Okay, thank you, DJ. Actually, already DJ has explained very well. Our three scenario has basically, one is baseline scenario and also optimistic and pessimistic. Baseline scenario is basically drawing on the GDP forecast, which is now made by the Economics Intelligence Unit and OECD and other international financial organizations. The optimistic scenario is basically assuming that the job recovery will be faster than economic recovery, which hasn't happened that often in the past. That's why we call it optimistic. In the case of pessimistic scenario, we, as you have pointed out, we assumed a new wave of the lockdown measures. The measure actually we have seen actually in the first and second quarter in many countries. So this is quite a big assumption. And in our analysis, if we have this new wave of the economic restriction or lockdown measures, the impact on the labor market could be comparable to those actual magnitude we have seen from the second quarter of this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go on to the next question. This one comes from Peter Kenny. If you can identify the outlet that you represent, please. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Peter Kenny. I'm a freelance journalist. I would like to ask you, Mr. Ryder, if you have any global breakdown of the difference between people who have totally lost jobs or people who have been put on compulsory leave or furlough, as it's euphemistically referred to.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for the question. The focus in this monitor is on in the decomposition of working hour losses, because I fully understand the point of the question. When we talk about loss in working hours, that could be through short time working. It could be through continuing to be employed but not working. It can be through inactivity. It could be through open unemployment. Now, the first thing I can say in response to your question is we observe what we regard as a very worrying increase in inactivity, withdrawal from the labour market effectively, which is growing more quickly than open unemployment. And of course, then we have all of the impacts of the question of the point which your question addresses on short-time working and furlough schemes. But let me go across to Sang-Yeon to see if we can put any numbers behind that.
Thank you, DJ. In the previous edition, 5th edition, we actually tried to give the full decomposition analysis of the working hour losses, taking into account all the elements Peter you already mentioned, like the shorter hours, people on leave, and also furlough schemes, and also unemployment or inactivities. This time, we only look at this actually the changes in the unemployment and also inactivities only, because we have new data from the labor survey from more than 20 countries. So as actually the Director General mentions, we see the significant increases in the inactivities, which requires particular policy attention. Following this, actually, the additions, we are planning to do another analysis, the full decomposition analysis on the working hour losses in the forthcoming edition.
Thanks, Sang-Yeon. Let's go on to John Sarcostas, please.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, good morning, Guy and Sang-Yeon and others. I would like to, perhaps Sang-Yeon could shed some light which sectors have been most affected. In earlier monitors, you gave us the areas most affected, whether the travel and leisure or retail, etc. Can you give us a bit of a snippet for our editors where the spike has occurred, given your earlier assessments? Thank you.
Yeah, Sang-Yeon, please. Yeah, we did indeed do, I think, quite a detailed sectoral analysis and breakdown in previous monitors, but there may be something to add.
Yeah, John, thank you so much. That's one of the issues we really want to revisit actually in the forthcoming edition. But in the meantime, all I can say is that the sector we identify actually as the being hit hard by the pandemic, they continue to be actually they suffered quite severely from the pandemic. The most recently, probably you may see something news coverage in recent weeks. There seems to be some kind of some modest recovery in the case of the manufacturing sector. But at the same time, when you look at the service sector, especially some of the consumer, service sector, like the personal service and or other related matters, the countries are really struggling. So recently in the France and the Germany, for example, one of the big challenges at the moment is that how to regain the consumer confidence in the service. So that's going to continue to be the issue. This has much to do with the overall uncertainty about the pandemic. So the people are very much worried about the future at the moment. That actually now translated into the consumer, the behavior patterns. So you can see some increases in savings, and then at the same time, they are very like to tighten their belt when it comes to consumption. So our assessment right now is that it's very, very important for to have the significant kind of recovery or the good, actually reliable, effective public health policy measures in place in order to regain consumers' confidence, which seems to me to be one of the critical factors, especially in the advanced countries at the moment. The same for travel, as John, you mentioned.
John, you had a quick follow-up question?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Yes, Sang-Yeon, I was wondering if you have any data on concerning consumer demand. I understand there has been a recovery of some sort in China, but what is the situation in the United States? Are consumers still reluctant to spend?
On the US, we have the mixed stories there because of the loosening of the strict measures. You see some surge in the consumer spending in some sectors, but in some other sectors there are still kind of a bit of depressed actually the demand for a certain service. For example, tourism, it recovers a little bit, but not in full scale. But when it comes to the expenditure on the electronic stuff, I mean, you can see the big increases as well. So I must say in the US, we have the mixed stories.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on. Now it's Nina Larson from AFP. Over to you, Nina.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for taking my question. So first, I just wanted to ask about the 3.5 trillion lost in income. If you could maybe break that down in any way and sort of say who specifically is losing the most money here. I know you were talking about low middle income countries, but if you could sort of say where the pain is being felt the most, and also if it's possible to look a bit further ahead, how long do you think it will take for the labor market to recover? If you think it will actually recover, what impact do you see over, say the next decade on the labor market? Thank you.
Duncan, I think they're both for you.
Oh, thank you, DG. Labor market income losses. This, of course, the 10%. Around 11% income losses is quite a unprecedented level of the reduction. Historically speaking, you haven't seen such a big drop in any recent period. And this actually, huge income losses are to a large extent driven by the lower middle income countries. Which countries are in the lower middle income countries category? These are the countries, for example, let's say Brazil, for example, Mexico, and South Africa, and other countries. I mention all these countries because they are, according to the latest WTO statistics, they are explaining quite a significant proportion of the new cases and also the COVID-related deaths. So that actually brought about the massive labor market disruption in the working hours. So they are also, all these working hour losses translated in massive income losses. We are particularly worried about the implication of these actually income losses for the informal workers or who actually drop out of the labor market. It's very important to remember this is average figures. So some people may maintain their incomes as before, but some others may have seen much a larger income reduction, which actually put them in a very difficult situation in surviving, and in some cases putting them in a very in poverty situation. The second question about the possible recovery. That's something we really want to know, but we were using our all empirical analysis and all the intelligence together to make some meaningful outlook for the months to come and for years. But it's still difficult. But at the moment, the overall outlook for the recovery, as our Director General mentions, is a bit. We are a bit pessimistic at the moment in terms of the speed of recovery. There will be recovery, but the recovery may come later than we initially thought. And the strength of recovery may be weaker as well in light of the very latest development in terms of the pandemic and also the heavy labor market losses we have seen in recent weeks.
Yeah. Perhaps I can just supplement that just by drawing attention very simply in respect of that second question, the timing and extent of recovery. Just note from this monitor that our baseline projection for the fourth quarter is now for 8.6% loss in working hours. That's up from 4.9%. That was the projection we made, what, at the end of June, Sang-Yeon?
Yeah, that's right.
It shows, if nothing else, it shows that things are looking worse today than they did at the end of June. Secondly, it shows the hazards of trying to be too precise or overconfident in respect of projections beyond any immediate horizons. One thing I think I can add to this answer is that it is very clear, is it not, that the capacity and the speed with which the global economy can get out of its labor market slump is intimately linked to our capacity to control the pandemic. There is an intimate link between, our health performance and our social and economic performance, and at times when policymakers may be faced with decisions which might seem to present a trade-off between those two objectives, looked in the larger picture, these two things are very, very intimately intertwined, and we have to act on that understanding.
Okay, let's move on. Next is Jamie Keaton from the Associated Press. Over to you.
Hello, thank you for taking my question. Mr. Ryder, I wanted to just follow up on what you mentioned earlier about the 1%, the 45 billion being 1% of total stimulus, and for the 45 billion needed by the lowest income countries. What should be done about that? Who should be helping that, helping pay for that? Is that a responsibility of the rich countries to help the poor countries? Who can help?
Yeah, it's a really fundamental question. I'm tempted to answer it in the terms that the UN Secretary General posed it at the General Assembly this week, when he made a call for global unity in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think he was referring to it in all of its dimensions, be it health, be it social economic, be it humanitarian. But that answer, a call to unity and common purpose and solidarity is what I would use to answer your question. As our figures show, a relatively small effort from high-income countries relative to the effort they're making in their own country, a very necessary and considerable effort, but a relatively small effort in comparison to that could make an extraordinary difference in the countries which are least able to mobilize their own resources for this purpose. So that's my answer. So who is that? It means the international community, it means international institutions, it means the Bretton Woods institutions, but it also means individual countries who are in a position to make that effort. It's somewhat distressing to note that the call to global unity by the Secretary General was followed by a fairly clear display of a lack of such unity in the debate in the General Assembly. So my view is that we have to keep insisting on the need for this effort, not only as an act of solidarity, but as an act of enlightened self-interest, because the fact of the matter is, there is truth behind this rather sort of cliched phrase that none of us are out of this until all of us are out of it, but it is an illusion to think that any country in isolation will overcome the health or the social and economic implications of this pandemic unless all other countries are able to overcome it as well. So that's my answer to the point you make.
Thanks. Let's go over now to Gabriela Sotomayor, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for taking my question, Mr. Ryder. And well, I have a question on Mexico, because according to some studies in 2020, Mexico will fall 10%, the economy of Mexico, the deepest drop among Latin American countries. And I read that unemployment reached 23 million people in July. I don't know if you have the same numbers, if you can talk about this. And lastly, well, I wanted to ask about the debate yesterday, because we are talking about solidarity, you are talking about solidarity, but yesterday what I observed was warring nationalism in the general debate. So, but you already talked about that, but if you can say something more. Thank you.
Let me take the more general question and then perhaps pass it across to Sang-Yon for the specific Mexican numbers that you have asked about. Look, it is very, very clear that we are not seeing the level of common purpose in the international community, the level of, I don't like to say solidarity, that's a word that comes most quickly to my mind, but simply common purpose and common endeavor in overcoming this pandemic. And that is very worrying. And I'm afraid that the General Assembly debate, as it's unfolded up until this point, rather emphasizes the deficits in common purpose internationally than any obvious move towards an improvement of that situation. And that is regrettable. It doesn't mean we should give up or desist from those efforts, but I think it means we have to insist ever more strongly on the case that I've tried to set out for such international cooperation. As I say, I'm going to pass over to Sang-Yon in terms of Mexico, but I will note in making that that transition that the Americas continues to stand out in all of the figures on working hour losses, on income losses, as significantly the most hard hit region of the world. That's been evident since the middle of the year, and it doesn't seem to be changing very much. And that is, on a regional basis, a rather somber background to the information that Sang-Yon can share with you in respect of Mexico in particular.
So thank you, DJ. On the Mexico, as you point out, there is quite a substantial labor market disruption. In our estimate, the overall the working hour losses in Mexico will be probably more than 30%, and also in terms of employment, probably around the 17 or 18% employment decline for men and women. But the most important is in recent statistic, interesting enough, in Mexico, you don't see much change in unemployment. So you actually slight increase like by 0.2 percentage points in August. But what really important here is that in Mexico has seen huge increase in inactivities, while actually unemployment remains very stable. So that's where the real actually labor market challenges are in Mexico. My understanding is that the government has introduced a lot of policies to support the micro enterprises and also provide income support for the workers and informal workers and domestic workers. So we are we are in the process of the analyzing what has been the impact of these policies on the working hour losses and income. So as soon as we have the assessment ready, we'll be more than happy to share it with you. Thank you.
Okay, let's go over now to Assis Moreira, and that's last hand that I see up. So if anyone else has any questions, please do raise your hand. Assis, over to you, please.
Hello. Good morning. It's concerning Brazil. Do we have the figures concerning the labor income losses in Brazil? And would you say that Brazil is one of the most affected in terms of income losses, income loss labor? And how is the figure for Brazil actually?
I think as I mentioned, this huge global income losses, as actually our Director General introduced to you, are really heavily influenced by the changes in the income countries, including like Mexico, South Africa, and India and China and others. And in the case of Brazil, Brazil is one of them. I wouldn't say Brazil is the most important country in explaining this global income losses, but I can say the recent development in Brazil actually explain a quite important part of the global income losses in the recent the quarters.
Okay, thanks. Just to say that if you have any more country-specific questions, to please get in touch with Rosalind Yard or the newsroom, and we'll put you in touch with the regional experts. Now, I see Nina, you have a follow-up question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It actually is a country-specific question. I wanted to ask about the U.S. In the Americas, if you could give us some idea of income loss there. Thank you.
Sangjun?
Income loss in the US.
Yeah, we do not actually report on the very country-specific data on the U.S. As indicated, we expect we estimate quite a significant level of income losses in the United States as well. But I don't have any country-specific data at the moment. If you need, I will be happy to discuss further with you. But one important point I want to mention in the case of the U.S., the initial income losses in the U.S. has been compensated by the various government intervention, especially income support measures, and so that is how actually the overall consumer demand, if you like, somehow maintains for the last couple of quarters. In my view, the scale of the labor market disruption in the third quarter, as reported in the Monitor, may continue, but a bit less, but at the very high, a large scale. So, which basically means the government support may be crucial in some compensating or offsetting the possible income losses coming from the labor market disruption. I know this is one of the focus area for the debate. I just want to flag the importance of this issue.
Thanks, Sangjun. Yeah, any country-specific questions, please do get in touch with us through the newsroom, and we'll do our best to get back to you with the information, or to put you in touch with the right person to answer that country-specific question. Now, any other questions on the findings of the report? I don't see any hands up, but I'll wait a few seconds to see if anyone has any last question before we come to a close. No, I don't see any. Okay, so we'll put an end to this press briefing. Thank you very much for taking part. Oh, I see, Gabriela, you have one more. Hopefully it's not specific to Mexico, because otherwise we'll probably need to get back to you, but you have the floor, please.
Yes, it's just one quick question about, I mean, I don't know how to ask, but what's going to happen with all the people without employment? Do you fear social unrest? What will happen? I mean.
Well, thank you. You said you don't know how to ask it, and I don't know how to answer it. Is the short response to that one, because there is no answer to that question right now. Partly because the future trajectory of the pandemic itself, the future trajectory, therefore, of the extent and nature of the economic and social impact, which has already been unprecedented. They're unknowables at this point. They really are unknowables. But, I think it is fair to say, and we can all come together on this, that we're going to come out of this pandemic, if we can think of that moment when we come out of it as such, in a world that is going to have much higher unemployment, much higher poverty, much higher inequality, and I think as a logical and inevitable consequence, higher degrees of social frustration, maybe political anger. And these are elements that we truly have to contemplate as we tackle the pandemic. That much we can say. Last Friday, again, I revert to the UN General Assembly to give you the global perspective. The governments of the world said, okay, we're in the depths of a very, very grave pandemic crisis, but we recommit ourselves to the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and its 17 goals, which, were it to be realized would give a very positive answer to the question that's just been put. It means we could come out of this crisis actually very much better than we went into it. But that is going to require an extraordinary acceleration of pre-existing efforts and an effort to build back. We talk a lot about building back better, but it's also about building back differently. It's not about just reverting to where we were before this global pandemic. So the point here I want to make is our organization is one that's been thinking about the future of work for the last 18 months or so, because we had our centenary last year. You know, we cannot think that the task ahead is to recover from the pandemic and then think about all of the other things we have to do, tackling climate change, tackling demographic issues, biodiversity, whatever it is. We actually, digital transformations, we have to build all of those considerations into the recovery process. And that is a tough lift. It's a heavy lift. And up until now, it's not happening on anything like the scale it would need to happen. So yeah, there's a very, very high climb, tough climb ahead of us. It will require that global effort to which I have previously referred, but the circumstances that we find ourselves in require that effort.
Okay, thank you, DG. I think now we have come to the end of the press conference. Just a reminder that we will make this press briefing, the video available after the embargo lifts, which is 1 p.m. Geneva time. And like I said, if you have any other questions, any follow-up questions, please do get in touch with newsroom@ilo.org. That's it. Thank you very much for taking part, and I hope you all stay well. Bye-bye.